Hello and welcome to CLAIR's presentation for the Skills Development Conference this year. Due to the situation involving coronavirus, we have decided to deliver this fully online. And typically we have some kind of group discussion component in our SDC presentations, but most participants this year will be viewing this not in a group setting but by themselves. So we've designed this to be a bit more of a traditional lecture style format. We here at CLAIR do hope that you find today's content useful and that you're able to utilize it not only during your time on the JET program, but also in the years beyond. With that said, let's get started. So my name is Pierce. I'm a program coordinator at CLAIR, and I was a former ALT for 3 years in Tokyo. I'm actually a bit sad that I don't get to go out and visit for SDC this year, because I always look forward to getting out of Tokyo and going to the other prefectures, which are very beautiful around this time of year. But in spite of everything, we here at CLAIR are continuing to do our best to deliver training materials, so I hope you enjoy this presentation. There's a book that I'll be heavily drawing on for this presentation, and I'd like to introduce a quote from that book. "I've been graded, rated, and ranked, coached, screened, and scored. I've been picked first, picked last, and not picked at all. And that was just kindergarten." So you've been surrounded by feedback your whole life. Can you think back to some specific times when you received feedback on something? It can be as recent as this morning or as long ago as kindergarten. Please take a few minutes to write down 2 examples of when you received feedback. Try to think of 2 that particularly stand out in your memory from your own life. They could be a work review or a report card, a test score. It could be advice from a coach or a teacher or a parent, a rejection letter from a school or a job that you applied for. So it can be really anything. Please pause for 3 minutes while you think and write about these 2 past experiences of when you received feedback and how you felt about them. All right, thank you for taking some time to reflect on your past feedback. And again, did that feedback make you feel upset or even angry? Did you feel defeated or lost? Or maybe you felt like you were on top of the world? So here are the main questions I would like to answer today. What is feedback and why is it important? How do we deliver a message so that people accept it and make changes? And how do we accept feedback that we are offered? And in particular, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this last point for a number of reasons, but primarily because this is probably the key factor when it comes to feedback actually resulting in some kind of change. Indeed, your receiving of that feedback and your decision to ultimately accept or reject all or part of it is the only part of the process that you have 100% control over. And sadly, the part that we do not have control over, the feedback givers, are usually less than perfect at giving feedback. And so we'll be spending the bulk of our time today talking about this last point, figuring out how to find diamonds in the rough, so to speak, in the feedback that gets thrown at us constantly. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I would like to ask one more question. Why are we even talking about feedback today? What is feedback anyway, and why is it important? Is it important? I'd like to ask you to take a moment to ponder these questions. Start by writing down your thoughts on these 3 questions. Number 1, what is feedback? Number 2, is it important? And number 3, if it is important, why is it important? So I'd like to go ahead and just ask you to take maybe 3, possibly 4 minutes to write. And if you have groups or others around you, please, by all means, use some of that time to share and discuss your answers once you've got some ideas written down. So please pause the video for about 3 to 4 minutes so you can take some time to think and write. Okay, so let's get to the bottom of some of these questions. So the first question, what is feedback? Well, here's one definition. It's how we learn about ourselves, from our experiences and from others. How we learn from life, basically. It does take some obvious forms, like a performance review, a post-lesson chat with your team teacher, or feedback about a lesson plan or an activity idea that you came up with. But some forms of feedback aren't so obvious. It may not be obvious, but it is everywhere. It's the way your students' eyes light up when they finally get the right answer, or the same student coming back to you over and over again for advice and help with their work. It could be what your knee is trying to tell you about your diminishing spryness when you try to run in the relay race on sports day. Or it could be the way your coworkers roll their eyes in unison when upper management makes a comment completely out of touch with reality. It can be formal or informal, direct or implicit, totally obvious or so subtle that you're not even sure what it is. But is it really worth it? Why can feedback be such a painful and conflicting process? The dilemma is that while we all want to learn and improve, we also want to be loved and accepted for who we are and how we are, right now. But the very fact of feedback somehow suggests that how we are is not quite okay. So what can we do to manage the tension between our drive to learn and our longing for acceptance? How do we reduce anxiety in the face of feedback and learn in spite of the fear? Furthermore, do we really need feedback? Well, not giving feedback is risky because problems will fester, senior level staff and the system in which everyone operates will lose credibility, the team will underperform, and those who do manage to continue performing at a higher level may grow to resent those who aren't pulling their weight without having to face any consequences. And when handled poorly by either the giver or the receiver, feedback can damage trust, relationships, motivation, and cohesion within an organization. So it's clear that feedback is essential in some sense. Now that we have a better idea of what feedback is and why it's important, I'd like to start with 6 characteristics of effective feedback. And we can think about these as general guidelines, especially when giving feedback. We'll go through each one individually, starting with the idea that feedback should usually be given privately when possible. Now, why do I say this? Because on one hand, you might think that it makes more sense to give feedback in public, where the receiver can be held more accountable for their actions, and where you can make an example out of this person as a means of teaching others about what kind of behavior is desirable. That is one side of the argument, and while it may be effective, think of yourself being on the receiving end of this kind of feedback. If the feedback is negative, or if there's something potentially embarrassing about it, the feedback should be given in private. While the former strategy may be somewhat effective as a preventative tool, being publicly shamed in front of others means that the receiver is actually less likely to actually take the feedback to heart and take action to improve. Even if the feedback is positive, some people may not appreciate the extra attention brought to them after being praised publicly, especially students in Japan. Similarly, frequently lavishing praise on the receiver in public kind of makes it less special over time, so that when they actually have gone and done something truly deserving of high praise, that praise suddenly means less or feels less special. Next, feedback should be balanced. Decide whether criticism is required and try not to make the recipient feel attacked or speak to them in a way that makes it seem like everything about their work is negative. You might consider leading with a positive comment about their work, but don't take too long to get to the heart of the matter, as to avoid unnecessary anxiety for the recipient. On this point, you may have heard about something called a feedback sandwich, which is this idea of padding your actual feedback between 2 buns or bread slices, so to speak, of positive feedback. It's worth pointing out the flaws in this method, the primary one being that this could be seen as beating around the bush, potentially eroding trust in the giver over time. Furthermore, the recipient may forget about your positive comment as soon as you transition to the negative one, and any positive comments following the constructive feedback might actually distort the importance of that constructive feedback. You should be a little more sparing in how you give out positive feedback in order to help keep its value from diminishing. And following the discussion, you can express confidence in their ability to improve rather than just offer generic praise. Feedback should also be relevant. This sounds obvious, but you should keep feedback focused on the matter at hand and only give feedback on things that the receiver actually has control over. For example, it's not fair to complain about the quality of printouts for a lesson when the receiver only has access to an ancient printer. Avoid general statements like, "You seem unmotivated." Be specific. "You arrived late to work 2 times last week and you stopped participating in department meetings." Now, in real life, people usually don't give such detailed feedback, so much of the responsibility will be on the receiver to help the giver sort out the raw observations behind these labels. I'll talk more about labels later. Another thing to strive for is to base your comments on documentation, facts, and your own observation rather than relying on what another colleague told you or what you've overheard. Finally, feedback should be impersonal. By this, I mean that you should separate the person from the action. Focus on the behavior that is unsatisfactory rather than judge the person because of it. In other words, give feedback on their actions, and similar to some of the previous points, do not make it an attack on the individual. So to recap, when you find yourself in the position of giving someone else feedback, be they a colleague, a student, or a loved one, please try to keep these 6 general guidelines in mind. And when you deliver your message, one way to make it easier for the receiver to accept your feedback is to simply name one thing. That's it, just one thing for them to improve at a time. This way, they'll fully be able to comprehend the needed changes, and then you can spend more time offering examples, developing a course of action, and expressing confidence in their ability to improve. You should also live up to your desires of that person by modeling the behavior yourself. Take responsibility for your mistakes, and those around you will be encouraged to do the same. Similarly, if you try a suggestion from your coworker, they should be more open to trying out your suggestions as well. Third, on a slightly more nebulous point, you should remember that feedback isn't just about the quality of the advice or the accuracy of the assessments. You're giving feedback in the context of a relationship, so you need to have a willingness to show that you don't have it all figured out, and that you are bringing your whole self, flaws, uncertainties, and everything, into the relationship. Now, this leads us to the main portion of our presentation, and the theme that I want you to remember and ultimately take away from the lecture is this idea that pull beats push. The key player is not the giver, but the receiver. Let's talk about why this is the case. When it comes to receiving feedback, as the receiver, you are in control of what you do and don't let in, how you make sense of what you're hearing, and whether you choose to change. Indeed, the word pull highlights a truth often ignored. The key variable in your growth is not your teacher, supervisor, or colleague. It's you. It's well and good to hope for that special mentor or coach, and you should cherish the ones you do come across, but you should not put off learning until those people arrive in your life. Unfortunately, our lives do tend to be populated by people who are not those rare, exceptional leaders and mentors. And in their defense, they're probably doing their best without knowing any better, or they may be too busy to give us the time we need, or perhaps they're just not really good at giving feedback or coaching. But the majority of our learning is going to have to come from people like this. And so, if we're serious about our growth and improvement, we have no choice but to get good at learning from just about anyone. This probably makes sense now that I've phrased it in this way. But how do you actually go about creating more pull? Well, there are three main approaches that I would like to talk about. The first is to recognize and manage your resistance to feedback. You're in control of whether you accept feedback and how much, if so. We'll talk about learning how to spot and deal with so-called feedback triggers that prevent you from engaging skillfully in a conversation. And we'll also discuss the importance of cultivating a growth identity that will help you find insights to help you grow, even when feedback seems somehow off. The first thing to keep in mind, like I mentioned, is that you don't always have to take the feedback. Receiving feedback well means engaging in the conversation skillfully and making thoughtful choices about how and whether to use the information you're getting. You should set limits on the feedback you get, and sometimes you just need to say no. We all need some space sometimes to discover who we are and how we are going to grow. Now, with that in the back of your mind, you should actively seek feedback. Research shows that feedback-seeking behavior has been linked to higher job satisfaction, greater creativity on the job, faster adaptation in a new organization or role, and lower turnover. Interestingly, seeking out negative feedback is associated with higher performance ratings. On the other hand, shutting out feedback or responding with defensiveness and arguments means you have to live in constant fear of pointless conflicts. Discussion no longer becomes honest and feedback becomes non-existent, meaning that the receiver has no chance to understand what's wrong or how to fix it. A key factor in receiving feedback well is recognizing what are called feedback triggers. As you can probably guess by the name, these refer to a triggered reaction, so to speak, that makes us defend or attack or retreat when we receive feedback that leaves us angry, confused, or frustrated. There are three primary triggers that I would like to talk about: those relating to the truth or validity of the feedback itself, those that stem from feedback that is colored by the relationship between the giver and the receiver, and finally, identity triggers, which have to do with the story we tell ourselves about who we are and what the future holds for us, and how we react when our story comes under attack. The first one, truth, has to do with the substance of the feedback itself. Maybe it's somehow off, or unhelpful, or just plain untrue. Perhaps the perception someone has of us is outdated or incomplete. Why is it that when we give feedback to someone else, we usually feel right, but when the tables are turned, we often feel that the feedback we're receiving is at least a bit wrong? Well, perhaps it is, or at least some of it. But our goal should be to look for the nuggets of truth that are there, few though they may be, because that's what's going to help us grow. So let's think about how we can approach this. The first thing we should focus on is thinking about exactly what kind of feedback we're dealing with. Feedback will usually fall under one of these three categories: appreciation, or thank you, coaching, or here's a better way to do it, and evaluation, meaning here's where you stand. Now, we need all three types of these feedback. Evaluation helps us, again, know where we stand, helps us set expectations, and helps us feel secure. Coaching helps us focus our time and energy on where it really matters. It helps us accelerate our learning and keeps our relationships healthy. And appreciation to show that our hard work matters. But problems start to occur when we want or hear one type of feedback, but the giver actually means another. Let's unpack these a bit to see what I mean. So we need all three of these types of feedback. Again, evaluation helps us to know where we stand, to set expectations, and to feel reassured. Coaching accelerates our learning, and appreciation helps us feel like our work is worthwhile. Problems arise when the receiver wants or hears one kind of feedback, but the giver actually means another. For example, you show your co-teacher a lesson plan that you're working on. Right now, all you're looking for is a little encouragement, something like, hey, cool, keep working at it. But what you get instead is a list of 10 different things you need to fix. Now let's flip it around. You show the work to your team teacher hoping for a list of things that you could improve on, and instead you just get a, hey, cool, keep working on it. How is that going to help? To avoid misunderstanding each other, align your purposes and separate as much as possible evaluation from coaching and appreciation. Additionally, you should ask 3 questions about the feedback. Number 1, what's my purpose in giving or receiving this feedback? Number 2, is it the right purpose from my point of view? And then, is it the right purpose from the other person's point of view? Another rule of thumb to keep in mind is that explicit disagreement is better than implicit misunderstanding. Explicit disagreement leads to clarity, and it's the first step in each of you getting your differing needs met. The receiver may need to take the lead and ask questions like, you're saying this is coaching, but I'm hearing it as evaluation too. Am I right that you're saying I'm falling behind? So understanding is job 1. Feedback arrives with generic labels. Now, what are labels? They're these sort of broad, general ways to describe things. It might describe what's inside a soup can, for example. But you wouldn't eat a label on a soup can, and similarly, there's no nutritional value to a feedback label either. Here are some examples. Be more proactive. Speak up more. Don't be so selfish. Act your age. You need boundaries. Here's an idea. Think of something that bothers you about someone close to you. It could be your sibling, your boss, friend, or coworker. And you could think of multiple people, of course. Look at these phrases and take a minute or so to write them down and complete them. Yes, you are assigning these labels on purpose. He's so ... She's too ... Please pause and take a minute or 2 to write and finish these sentences based on people in your life. So how did you come up with those labels on the previous slide? Well, in your mind, you have an HD movie of those people that captures everything you mean by those labels. But when you convey those labels to someone else, the movie is not attached, only some vague words. The problem with all this is that feedback givers are usually not very skilled, or at least they are certainly imperfect. Throughout your life, then, it will fall to you, as the receiver, to work to understand what's underneath the feedback label. Once you start looking for labels, though, spotting them is actually pretty easy. But the hard part is remembering to look in the first place. And once you've spotted a label, you should fight the temptation to fill in your own meaning. The most common advice about feedback is usually to be specific. And ironically, this is also a label, but we'll ignore that. To get more specific, though, we do want to ask a couple of questions. Where is the feedback coming from? In other words, what is the difference between the giver's data, or their observations, and their interpretation of that data? And then, where is that feedback going? Meaning, if you wanted to follow their advice, would you know how to do so? So data, again, is anything they've seen, felt, heard, smelled, touched, tasted, remembered, or read. Data isn't just facts and figures, but also anything directly observed. For example, your team teacher notices that you still do not know the names of any students. Or your coworkers notice that your desk is constantly cluttered and that you're frequently coming in just seconds before the morning chime. Data can be positive things too, of course. Maybe without being asked, you stayed a bit late to help a student who was struggling to understand a difficult grammar point, or your vice principal saw you pick up some trash in the hallway. That data is interpreted and filtered based on that person's past experiences, values, assumptions, and implicit rules about the world. If your team teacher comments, "I noticed that you still don't know the names of any students," what might that imply? That you're lazy and unprofessional, or that you don't care about the students? Or perhaps They just think that memorizing foreign names can be tough, and they're just leading up to wanting to help you memorize them. Of course, it would be easier if feedback givers could just share this data. For example, rather than saying, "Your lesson plan is confusing and doesn't flow well," they could be more specific and tell you, "I noticed that you didn't specify the size of the groups or length of time for discussion. Also, I think this activity would make a little more sense at the end of the lesson." Of course, this never happens in real life, so the responsibility really is on the receiver to help the giver sort out the raw observations behind those labels. One way you might do this is to ask, "What do you mean I should be more enthusiastic in class?" "Oh, it's my tone? What about my tone? Is it my body language? Show me. Model it. Give me an example." Always be willing to help the giver clarify in order to get under these labels. Again, try not to fill in your own meaning when you receive feedback labels. And remember that spotting labels actually becomes quite easy once you become aware of it and start trying. Let's take the example just now from the previous slide and say your team teacher suggests that you be more enthusiastic in class. It's a vague statement. What does that actually mean? How about be more playful with students and smile more? Or speak with more volume and energy? Or try harder to come up with activities that will engage students and make them less passive? Or maybe be a bit more spontaneous and proactive instead of waiting for me to cue you in all the time. What do you think? Take a moment to consider the correct answer. Well, the correct answer is you just won't know until you talk about it. And you're not going to talk about it if you assume that you already know, which is why you should be careful not to assign your own meaning to labels. It also helps us to switch from wrong spotting to difference spotting. You'll start to get good at label spotting, but you shouldn't completely dismiss the giver's views when you spot them. It'll help if you shift away from "that's wrong" to "tell me more. Let's figure out why we see this differently." But why does this happen in the first place? Why is it that when we see a label, we're quick to assign meaning to it? Why do we interpret feedback differently? Well, the answer is simply that we all have different data, and we all interpret that data differently. The first point is simply different data. We are all different people inhabiting different bodies. We were all raised at least somewhat differently and have different educational backgrounds. Some data might also just be plain inaccessible to the giver or the receiver. For example, your team teacher attends certain meetings and has sensitive conversations with parents that you might not. And even when we do have access to the same data, we usually notice different things. Since there is only so much information that we can take in, we have to select small samples to pay attention to and ignore the rest. We also have biases that affect our data collection, including biases about ourselves. Would you say that you're a better driver than the average person? Well, you're not alone. Studies regularly show that over 80% of drivers think that they are better than average. And I'm no math wizard, but I don't think that's how math works. It's also human nature to seek out data that confirms your pre-existing view of the world. In every organization, every culture, every family, there is a sense of how we do things around here. These are implicit rules that aren't just our rules, but the rules, and few people question them. For example, when I say "be on time," what does that mean to you? Does it mean seated and ready to go? Or just wandering in? How about asking questions at a staff meeting? Does that show engagement, or is it rude and contrarian? The same applies to general issues or worldviews. In these following examples, think about which statement you tend to agree with more. Is it a dog-eat-dog world, or is it smile and the world smiles with you? What about conflict is bad versus conflict is healthy? Or, it's important to be liked versus it's important to be respected. Now, there is no right answer to any of these, and it certainly doesn't have to be 100% one way or the other, but the fact is that everyone has their own version of the truth, their own way of interpreting the world around them. So now that we have a better idea of how to understand feedback that is given to us, I'd like to point out something that we all have: blind spots. Now, the thing with blind spots is that we're not only blind to certain things about ourselves, but we can also be blind to the fact that we're blind. And I'll give you a hint: you have blind spots too, even if you think you don't. Blind spots are often exacerbated because we downplay our emotions. We blame the situation rather than ourselves, and we judge ourselves based on our intentions rather than the outcome. So what's the solution? In order to see ourselves and our blind spots, we need help from others. The very nature of blind spots means that we cannot see them. Invite others to be an honest mirror to help you see yourself in the moment. Now, I'd like to bring this back around full circle, since we've been talking about truth triggers for a while now. And the fact is that the truth can be very complicated. What I'd like for you to take away from this section is basically that managing truth triggers is not about pretending there's something to learn or saying you think it's right if you think it's wrong. It's about recognizing that it's always more complicated than it appears and working hard to first understand. And even if you decide that 90% of the feedback is off target, that last golden 10% might be just the insight that you need to grow. Now that we have a better idea of how to see the feedback clearly, let's talk not about the feedback itself, but our relationship with the person giving us the feedback. This is the challenge of we. Now, on one hand, you would think that it shouldn't matter who's offering us feedback. The advice is either good or bad. But the fact is that it does matter, and quite a lot. We can actually be more triggered by the person giving us feedback than by the feedback itself. And this can be a very common derailer of feedback conversations. What can end up happening is that they think we are the problem, and we think they are the problem. But it's usually not about you or me, it's usually about you and me. So let's take some time to learn more about how relationships can affect feedback, and while we do so, have a couple of feedback givers in mind from your own life, and think about what makes hearing feedback from them so hard sometimes, and what you might learn from them despite that difficulty. One of the most common ways for a feedback conversation to get derailed is for it to quite literally switch tracks, as if by a railroad switch. The topic is changed, usually from their feedback to us, for example, be on time, to our feedback to them. For example, don't talk to me that way. Now, that other topic might be important, but it's another conversation for another time. In any case, the original feedback is blocked because the topic of who defeats the topic of what. The way that this often happens is that when we feel hurt or frustrated, ignored, offended, or anxious, we usually try to keep feelings out of the picture. We use what appears to be well-intended coaching to instead offer a selection of so-called tips. But we're not really offering coaching for the other person's benefit, we're hoping they'll change for our benefit. So let's look at how to recognize when you've hit a relationship trigger and think about how to keep the conversation from getting derailed. Now, the switch track dynamic has 4 steps. 1, we get feedback, then we experience a relationship trigger, then we change the topic to how we feel, and last, we start talking past each other. Let's look at 2 key relationship triggers to get a better idea of what they look like. The first is what we think about the feedback giver. We might question their skill or judgment, their credibility. we might question their motives. And the other is how we feel treated by the giver. Do we feel appreciated by them? Do they give us appropriate space and control of our affairs? Do they respect and accept who we are? There is almost undoubtedly someone in your life who you admire or used to admire so much that their actions and advice seem to take on almost a golden glow. You'd hang on to their every word and strive to be more like them, and it seemed as though any input that came from them was wise, thoughtful, and deep, just by default. And then there's everybody else. People who you may not fully trust, or people who might not know really what they're talking about. We question their judgment and skill, that is, how, when, and where are they giving the feedback. These all reflect on the who. You might say something like, "Why would you say that in front of our boss?" Or, "You waited until now to bring this up?" We can also react to the giver's lack of expertise, background, and experience. Why would you listen to parenting advice from someone who's never been a parent? Or teaching advice from someone who's never stepped foot inside a classroom? Well, the fact is that we can often benefit from the insight of newcomers or outsiders who are unencumbered by knowledge of the way things are done. They might ask just the right naive question or offer a unique perspective. New ideas often come from those without traditional credibility, who are freer to think outside the box precisely because they don't know there is a box. Another type of credibility issue has to do with values and identity. We don't want to be the kind of people they are, so why would we take their coaching? Well, this is a fair concern to have, but more often than not, their feedback is aimed at helping you navigate the complex environment that you both share, or dealing with roadblocks that they have already seen before. So even if you ultimately choose to implement their advice in a way that's more consistent with your own values, you should not pre-disqualify that advice just because of who it's coming from. And last, we might question their motives. We fear that they're out to undermine or control us, or that they're putting their own interests above ours, or even that they might not care about us one way or the other. They're just giving us feedback so that they can check that obligatory box. We wonder if they're just saying nice things because they're too wishy-washy to tell us how they really feel. And then we wonder, what could they actually be saying behind our backs? And the problem here is that intentions are invisible. We care deeply about others' intentions, but we simply can't know what they are. And we end up going down this rabbit hole of trying to guess, only to resurface feeling even more uncertain. So the key here is to simply accept that we don't know their motives and we can't know, even if they try to explicitly tell us. How many times has someone told you that they're just trying to help, when it certainly didn't quite seem that way? And in any case, the question of intentions is a separate topic from the accuracy or the helpfulness of the feedback. Someone who is jealous or just plain mean to you might still have feedback that's dead right. And someone who really and truly does have your best interests at heart might still offer really poor advice that doesn't help you. So remember to treat trust and content as separate topics. Let's also consider how we feel treated by feedback givers. This involves topics like appreciation. Do they see our efforts and successes? Autonomy. Are we given appropriate space and control? And acceptance. Do they respect and accept who we are? We expect these things from all of our relationships. Let's say you've been voluntarily staying late to help students with their homework, and one day you accidentally leave the answer key for the entire textbook sitting on the table. A teacher comes in the next morning and finds it, and although you saw it as a relatively small mistake in the grand scheme of things, after all, you feel like you're kind of doing them a favor by staying late when you don't really have to, the teacher points out your mistake in front of all the other staff members, causing you to feel embarrassed. Now, of course, there are a number of problems with how this feedback is being delivered, but the biggest issue for you is that they should just be glad you're doing this in the first place. After all, no one was harmed. So the feedback is of course accurate. You do need to be more careful, but it still feels a bit unfair or out of balance in the grand scheme of things. We don't feel appreciated. And autonomy is about control. Our boundaries are invisible, both to others and even to us, until they've been violated. And it can be very easy for these boundaries to be violated. After all, of course, we want to be in control of our attitude, our behavior, our personality, how we dress and walk and talk. So when the autonomy map of the feedback giver and receiver clash, questions will come up about who gets to decide, who is in control. And that is certainly an important set of conversations to have explicitly and clearly. And the last one, again, is acceptance. And this is kind of complex terrain because the givers want us to change in some way. But we want to know that it's okay if we ultimately don't change. We want to be loved and accepted for who we are, mistakes and all. The first issue is that people have different definitions of acceptance. What might be intended as a small behavioral tweak could be interpreted as a complete rejection of character to the receiver. And the other issue is that when we say, accept me as I am, sometimes we're really just asking for immunity from critique. But the fact is that while we all need to feel accepted as we are, we also need to hear feedback, particularly when our behavior is affecting others. Being accepted isn't an escape hatch from responsibility. Sometimes feedback is created by the relationship itself. Every relationship is a unique pairing of sensitivities, preferences, and personalities. It's the nature of our particular pairing, rather than either of us individually, that creates friction. Is it that you're oversensitive, or are they insensitive? When these problems arise, instead of pointing fingers at each other, we need to put our fingers on the problem. The first thing you need to be able to do is spot the two topics on the table. That is, the original feedback and the relationship concern. Next, you need to give each topic its own conversation track and get both people on the same track at the same time. Last, we need to help givers be clearer about their original feedback, especially when the feedback itself relates to the relationship. If they seem to be giving you tips under the guise of trying to change your behavior, you might want to ask yourself, is this about helping me grow and improve, or is this the giver's way of raising an important relationship issue that's been upsetting them? And the last type of trigger that I'd like to talk about today has to do with our identities. Identity is the story we tell ourselves about who we are and what the future holds for us. When we receive feedback that's critical, that story suddenly comes under attack, and we react by counterattacking or passing out. Feedback can be threatening because it prompts question about the most challenging relationship you have, your relationship with yourself. Interestingly, not everyone reacts to feedback in the same way. And we also have different recovery periods. Indeed, your particular wiring, meaning your baseline sensitivity and how quickly you bounce back, influence how you experience both positive and negative feedback. Now, there is a lot of neuroscience involving left and right hemispheres, high and low baselines, swing states, and the amygdala that are sadly just a bit outside the scope of this presentation, but suffice it to say that wiring does matter. And research shows that these factors can vary as much as 3,000% among individuals, meaning that we are all wired very differently to handle feedback. I only point this out because this can kind of be liberating. It's just how you're built, like if you have naturally curly hair or flat feet. And once you learn your own wiring and tendencies, you'll be in a better position to improve your ability to handle negative feedback. But wiring is only part of the story. Research suggests a 50-40-10 formula for happiness. About 50% of our happiness is wired in and inherited from our parents, About 40% can be attributed to how we interpret and respond to what happens to us, and the last 10% is driven by our circumstances, where we live and with whom, where we work and with whom, the state of our health, and so forth. Now obviously, whether these are exact proportions is debatable, but what's key here is that there's a lot of room to move around in that 40 or so percent that we do have control over. So let's look at this essential 40%. Again, this is how we interpret and respond to things that happen to us, meaning we have 100% control over it. A good starting point is to mentally prepare yourself. Each of us reacts differently to criticism. Do you blame others? Do you change topics? Do you apologize and never change? Do you go silent? Do you panic? Knowing this tendency ahead of time and being able to name it to yourself in the moment will help you have some power over it. And when you catch yourself starting to have this typical defensive behavior, you can think, yep, this is the part where I start to have my overreactions. Not fighting or resisting those thoughts or reactions, but just noticing them for what they are. That will help you naturally calm down. Another thing you can do is prepare for the worst. And I'm not telling you to just be pessimistic, but inoculate yourself, so to speak, against the worst case scenario. Just ask, what's the worst that could happen? They'll reject my application. And then try that on emotionally. Reason through the possible consequences. Then, if actual bad news does arrive, you'll think, yes, this is what I feared might happen. I've seen this before. I'll be okay. This will help you think things through in a balanced and unhurried way, and have a plan B ready to go in your pocket. One more thing you can do is try to contain the feedback. What I mean by this is to think about the feedback and what it's about, and also what it isn't about. For example, you apply for your dream job and you don't get it. Your first thought is, I'll never get a job I like. But when you actually break it down into what that feedback, rejection from a job opening, is not about, well, it doesn't predict your future. It doesn't tell you if you'll get the next job. It doesn't say that you'll never work in your chosen field. And as you rope off, so to speak, the things that it's not about, it's easier to see and to learn from what it is about. Figuring out what the feedback is actually about and then doing something about it takes work, but it becomes easier when you realize that you need to work on one or two discrete things and not everything at the same time. The last big topic I would like to cover in this identity framework is the idea of cultivating a growth identity. Research at Stanford University points to two different ways people tell their identity story. One is a fixed mindset. This is the idea that people don't really change, and that hard work and practice doesn't really make a big difference. We are as we are, and every situation in life is essentially a referendum on whether you have the smarts or the ability that you think or hope you have. And the other is a growth mindset. This is the idea that we are ever evolving, and how we are now is simply how we are now. Hard work does matter, and challenge and even failure are the best ways to learn and improve. People in this mindset treat feedback as valuable information about where they stand now and what to work on next. What might be an upsetting verdict to others, they treat as welcome input. Now you might think, wait, aren't some traits fixed? And yes, researchers certainly argue over the degree to which various traits are fixed or elastic, and there is evidence for both. But where complete consensus can be made is that people do get better when they apply themselves, and people apply themselves when they believe they can get better. Effort matters most with the qualities in life that matter most. Things like intelligence, leadership, performance, confidence, compassion, creativity, self-awareness, and collaboration. These all grow with attention and improve with coaching. Okay, so we spent a lot of time talking essentially about how to receive feedback well. And obviously, our discussion has been much more nuanced than this. We talked about finding truth in feedback, how our relationships affect feedback, and how feedback can affect the story we tell about ourselves. But so far, I haven't really talked about how to actually have a conversation. And the thing is, I can't really teach you exactly how to have a conversation. I don't have any set phrases or model conversations or anything like that, because that's just not how conversations in real life work. In fact, rather than real life, let's turn to Pixar's beloved classic Toy Story to see what we can learn. Toy Story was the world's first feature-length computer animated film. But do you know how a computer actually animates these movies? Rather than drawing each frame individually, animators created what are called keyframes, basically key moments, and the computer would work to fill in the movement between those frames. And this concept of keyframes is kind of useful actually for talking about how conversations happen in real life. Again, we can't script conversations, and when we try, our partner always has this irritating tendency to not follow the lines that we've written for them. But we can recognize some keyframes, stages and moments in the conversations that can serve as these kind of landmarks. The first is the opening. What is the purpose of this conversation? What kind of feedback would I like? And what kind is my giver trying to give? Is the feedback negotiable or final? Is it a friendly suggestion or a command? The opening is your chance to clarify the mutual purpose of the conversation and suggest a kind of two-way exploration of the agenda. Note that you're not telling the feedback giver what they can or can't say, you're just trying to get aligned for the rest of the conversation. It's more about process than substance. Next is the body of the conversation, and I'd like to talk about 4 skills that you can use to navigate this part, starting with listening. Listening involves asking clarification questions, paraphrasing the giver's point of view, and then acknowledging their feelings. You should listen for data they have that you don't. Ask questions like, can you give me an example? What did that mean to you? Or, what are you worried about? You should also listen for impacts that you might be having that you're not even aware of because of your blind spots. Ask how what you're doing is impacting them. And be on the lookout for switch tracks that put a second topic on the table about your relationship. Think about your individual wiring. You might need to ask additional questions to keep yourself grounded and balanced. And finally, listen for coaching. What I mean by this is to focus on the opportunity to grow rather than the judgment implicit in the evaluation or coaching. Next is asserting. This has to do with making your own voice heard in the conversation, but keep in mind that this is not just persuading the giver that you're right. You're just adding your own data, interpretations, and feelings into the conversation to sort of fill in the gaps. Use statements like, I disagree with that advice, instead of, that advice is wrong. Or, that's upsetting to hear because that's not how I see myself, instead of, that's ridiculous, I'm not that kind of person. You should also attempt to manage the conversation as necessary. This is more about conversation process rather than substance. This is your chance to pause the conversation and step back and consider how it's going and how you might correct course if necessary. It's probably going to sound awkward, not like how regular people talk, but that's why it can be a powerful tool. Think of it kind of like a referee stopping the action of a game to make adjustments. For example, if you find yourself in a never-ending loop of frustration or disagreement, you might say, okay, we're deadlocked, we both need to agree on this, and we don't. Your solution is that I should give in, but as a process, that just doesn't feel fair to me. On the other hand, I don't know how to break this deadlock, so we've got to figure this out. what is a fair and efficient way to decide when we both don't agree. And finally, problem solving. This is where you ask, now what? What are you going to do with this feedback? Well, this is your chance to get creative. Are there new possibilities at hand? It can help at this point to listen for the interests behind the feedback, and then generate options that address those interests. For example, be more enthusiastic in class is a request for a change in behavior. But it's difficult to change deep-seated personality traits, so you might need to look for some kind of middle ground, wherein the feedback giver models some of that behavior they're looking for. They could also consider giving some creative and authoritative elbow room to the receiver, which might help them feel more passionate about the lesson, and thus inject a little more enthusiasm into their classes. Finally, we come to a close by talking about, well, closing a conversation. Sometimes it's very clear when a conversation is over. Someone gives up, walks out, shuts down, or time runs out. But all too often we skip this kind of crucial last step, which is figuring out exactly what we've agreed to and what to do next. And when this step is skipped, we can be disappointed by the lack of progress or confused by the other person's lofty expectations. So here's how you close with commitment. First of all, even a simple sentence like, I want to think about what you've said and let's talk tomorrow, will suffice. The goal is just to be clear so that both of you know where things stand. A few kinds of things that you can consider while you're wrapping up a conversation are action plans, meaning what, if anything, is each party going to work on, and what do you each agree to do to make that happen. Think about what impact, positive or negative, measuring benchmarks will have, and think about the possible consequences and talk about them if any of those benchmarks are not met. Procedural contracts, making agreements on the process for working on these promises. And finally, coming up with new strategies. Both at work and in your personal life, the friction that produces feedback often reflects differences between us that just aren't going to go away. Instead of thinking about finding solutions to problems, think in terms of finding new strategies. You will have to look for new ways to work around each other's imperfections, and at the end of the conversation, it helps to articulate the ideas that you've generated along the way. And remember that feedback conversations are rarely one-shot deals. They're usually a series of conversations over time, which is why it's important to regularly remind yourselves of where you stand, what you've accomplished, and what you'll try next. So, we've come a very long way since the beginning of our presentation. I hope that I've helped you think about feedback in a new light. Again, since much of our lives are spent receiving basically this endless stream of feedback, I've decided to focus primarily on how best to be on the receiving end of that feedback, so that I'm hoping that even as early as right after this presentation is finished, you can go out and start putting these ideas to use. And before I finish, I would like to just reiterate, if you take anything from this presentation today, I want it to be this. Regardless of your workplace or those around you, you are the most important person in your own learning. Your organization or team or boss might support or stifle feedback, but they can't stop you from learning. You don't have to depend on your annual review or your coworkers' willingness to mentor you. You can watch, ask questions, look for suggestions from colleagues and students or teachers at other schools, and even your friends. You are surrounded by people you can learn from, even if it doesn't seem like it at first. And although learning ultimately comes down to you, it is still a shared responsibility in some sense, especially so for team teachers. So I hope that the presentation can help you get the most out of the feedback that you receive and give on the JET program and beyond. Thank you again so much for your attention. I just have a few CLAIR resources that I'd like to mention before I close. We do have an ongoing selection of resources available to JET participants, such as Japanese language courses, grants and other resources for professional development, and so on. There's also a handy feedback and evaluation form in the General Information Handbook that you might actually be a bit more motivated to use after seeing this presentation now. You can find out more about all of these initiatives as they become available throughout the year by looking on the official JET program website up there at the top. And you can always just talk to your contracting organization supervisor if you want to learn more that way. So again, thank you very much for listening.